Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speakers this evening, Professor Victoria Baines and Professor Robin May.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for coming. Thank you, those of you joining us online. This is really exciting. It's also a wild experiment. We've never done this before. So if this is the worst lecture you've ever been to, you can quietly let us know afterwards. If it's the best lecture you've ever been to, please loudly let us know during the process. That'd be great.
Can I say anything could happen in the next 45 minutes?
And it probably will, exactly, yeah. It's like, this is like the Morecambe and Wise or the...
And I'm wearing the glasses.
Dick and Dom, if you're younger. It's a real pleasure to be here. And what we want to talk about tonight between us is this idea that maybe, as Richard said, by thinking about things from different disciplines, you can kind of learn stuff reciprocally and maybe do things that neither discipline alone can do. And the question really we're trying to ask between us tonight is not really, do computers get sick, but we know they get sick, right? Everyone, I'm sure, in this room has had that moment when you turn on your computer and there's a sort of little blue screen or a flashing dot or something you weren't expecting. So we know they get sick. The question is, can we learn something from human immunity that helps computers? And can we humans learn something from computers that helps us with human immunity? And between the two of us, we're going to try and answer that question in the next 45 minutes. Fingers crossed. So here goes. So I'm starting, and I'm starting by asking a little bit about how humans get sick. And those of you who've been to some of my previous lectures know that humans get sick in all sorts of spectacularly and really quite disgusting ways. And there are a whole panoply of things that infect us and cause diseases ranging from very, very mild to end-of-life triggering. But very, very broadly speaking, I think we can class those kind of human infections in three groups, or three human diseases in three groups, I should say. So first of all, there are diseases that are actually nothing to do with the outside world. They're not an infection. They are our own bodies going wrong, right? So if you think about cancer, for example, most cancers are spontaneous mutations. Some are caused by infectious disease, but the majority are not. Cardiovascular disease, these kind of things. These are your machinery going wrong intrinsically. So they're not caused by an infection, but they're nonetheless a disease. Then there are exogenous things, things outside that cause disease. And I think we can break those down into two broad groups. There are the things that get into your body but don't get into your cells. And they sit inside your body causing problems, but they never actually penetrate into your cells. So if you think about a parasitic worm, for example, appreciate some of you at home might be having your dinner whilst you're listening to this, but if you dwell on the fact that in your intestine at this moment, there may be a worm coiled around, it's causing a disease, but it's not inside your cells. Similarly, most bacteria, if you get a kind of lung bacterial pneumonia, the bacteria are growing outside of your cells, but within your lung. So those are internal in the sense of being within your organs, but external to your cells. And then the last category, and the most interesting ones to me, are the infectious agents that get into your body and then get inside your cells and hijack you from the inside out. And so this is all viruses. All viruses do this because viruses don't have any of the machinery they need to replicate themselves. So they have to get into your cells and borrow your machinery to do it. And it also includes some bacteria, some fungi, things like tuberculosis, a bacterial disease that relies on the bacteria being able to get into your cells, hijack them, and cause damage. And that group, I think, is the one that is most similar to some of the ways that computers get sick.
And actually, we talk about viruses in computing all the time. It would be a very short lecture, wouldn't it, if we didn't? If I just said, well, it was a nice idea, but we didn't find anything to talk about. Like a lot of things in IT, if you attend my lectures where we talk about, how does some of this language come about? A lot of it comes from science fiction. So in 1970, a guy called Gregory Benford wrote a short story called The Scarred Man. And in this short story, he talks about a piece of malicious software, malware, called simply virus. And the program that's engineered to fight it is called vaccine. But it's not until 1987 that we really see that kind of language making its way into serious research and into what we now call cybersecurity. Fred Cohen, he published an article in Computers and Security, in which he defined a computer virus as a program that can infect other programs by modifying them to include a possibly evolved copy of itself. Every program that gets infected may also act as a virus, and thus the infection grows. Well, Robin has also mentioned already worms. And actually, the thing in cybersecurity, the thing in computing that is most like a biological virus is what we call a worm. It's a bit confusing, really, isn't it? Now, worms are self-replicating pieces of malicious software, and they can self-replicate across a network without human intervention, a bit like a biological virus. And if you are as old as me, and dare I say, I don't know, maybe as old as Robin.
No one's that old.
You may remember the I Love You worm in the year 2000. Now, this infected 50 million computers in just 10 days. How did it do that? Well, it was a fantastic example of social engineering, because what do we want in life more than anything else, perhaps arguably more than money and more than security? We want to be loved. So when all these people received an email saying, kindly check the attached love letter coming from me, of course, they opened it. And what they actually found was that it was a Visual Basic file that overwrote all of the files on their computer and, this is the genius bit, sent itself to everybody in that user's address book. And that's how it spread so quickly. The trouble is that in computing, we also call things viruses when they don't really behave just like biological viruses. That's sometimes because it's quite good media shorthand, to call something a virus when it might not be. So let's have a look at some of the other things that might map to some of the nasties that Robin was just talking about, but might not necessarily be viruses in the strictest sense. Firstly, we have bugs, which strictly speaking are coding errors. They're just mistakes. But that means that they're vulnerabilities that can be exploited by the bad guys, and we'll come to that in a second. Why are they called bugs? Well, there's a story about this. There's an origin story, and I can't quite tell whether it's apocryphal or not, so I will leave you to decide whether we need to treat this with a pinch of salt. But if you've come to my lecture or heard my lecture online about the ancient history of computers and code, you will have heard of a fabulous woman called Rear Admiral Grace Hopper. She invented the first compiler program. So she is responsible for translating mathematical notation in computer programs into plain English so that people who weren't mathematicians could program computers. And in 1947, she was working on the Harvard Mark II computer, and they suddenly found a moth in the machinery of the computer that was disrupting the operations. And so, allegedly, she took the moth, she taped it into her logbook, and she wrote at the side of it, "First actual case of bug found." I will leave it to you to decide whether that is true or not, but it's a good enough origin myth, I think. Now, we have things called zero-day vulnerabilities, and as the name suggests, these are bugs, vulnerabilities in code that the people who operate it haven't found yet and that could do harm. So it becomes a race against time, because the bad guys, if they can exploit those vulnerabilities, if they can get into a system, if they can do damage, if they can steal credentials, obviously that's something we really want to avoid. We also have things in computing that are a little bit like parasites. So you may have heard the term botnet. That is a network of bots, of compromised computers, devices, that can then be used to attack other computers and systems and networks. So it's really kind of piggybacking, feeding on these zombie computers and hijacking their processing power. And quite often, the people whose computers are being used don't know that they're being hijacked in that way. So it's a really good analogy, I think, for parasitism.
I think there are parallels, you can see them already, and I particularly love the fact that the first ever computer bug was actually genuinely a biological bug. And I think one of the questions that arises is, how do these different sorts of either biological or computational infections propagate themselves and hijack their systems, either us or our computers, and how can we learn from that to kind of tackle them? So how do we get hijacked? And we're going to focus primarily on viruses because basically we know the most about viruses. They're the simplest kind of infection. Most viruses have only a few genes as opposed to, for example, the 20,000 genes that you have as a human. They're relatively simple organisms, and we understand a lot about how they hijack our own bodies. And at a basic level, they all do something in common, which is they all need to replicate themselves using your machinery, your cell's machinery. And so the first thing that a virus needs to do when it gets into your body is to make more copies of itself. And it does that by hijacking the machinery that you use to produce proteins in your own cells. So, for example, as you're sitting here listening to this, your cells are making keratin, a protein to make hair and nails. They're making pigment proteins for your eyes. They're making all sorts of proteins to maintain your cellular function. And they do that in quite a straightforward way. You have a recipe book in every cell of your body, more or less, which is written in DNA, right? We know that that's your genome. That tells everything about you. That recipe book contains all the ingredients that you're going to need to make every protein you might possibly want. Not all your cells produce all your proteins, right? You don't need to produce hair protein if you're a kidney cell, for example. So only some different recipes from that whole genome are used by any cell at a time. And so the working ones, the ones you need in a cell, are transcribed into this molecule called RNA, this pink molecule here. It's like having a written out copy. If you have your grandma's precious recipe book, you don't want to kind of cover it in flour and butter when you're cooking, so you might write out a recipe on a post-it note to use. So your pink RNA copy is your working copy. So every cell of your body is looking in its genome and working out which genes it needs to express to produce. It makes a working copy into RNA, and then it uses that RNA working copy to produce a protein, like that keratin protein to make your hair, for example. And that's happening in all the cells of your body pretty much all the time. So when a virus gets into your cell, what it needs to do is it needs to get into this process and say, instead of making human proteins, I want you to make virus proteins. And that is what viruses do. And broadly speaking, there are sort of two big ways they do that. Some viruses are composed of DNA, just like us. They have a genome written in DNA, they're DNA viruses. And so when they get into a cell, they fuse with one of your cells, and they drop their DNA in. And your cell then looks at DNA and says, that looks to me like a working copy of a bit of DNA. I'll do what I normally do with DNA. I shall make a copy of it, a functional copy into RNA, and I shall produce the protein, unwittingly producing a viral protein instead of a human protein. Another group of viruses are even simpler. They have a genome that is composed not of DNA, but of RNA, this working copy, this red copy already. They've short-circuited that first step. And so what they have to do is they get into your cells and they inject in your RNA, and there's no need for them to trick the cell into thinking it has to use the DNA. It's already a functional copy. And so the cell immediately realizes, okay, I've made a copy of this apparently. I must need to produce the protein. I will go ahead and I will produce this protein. Either way, the result is the same. Your cell is now switching away from producing those blue eye pigments or those keratin proteins or whatever, and starting to produce viral proteins instead. So that hijacking is what fundamentally causes disease, because instead of producing cells to maintain your own physiology, you're producing things to maintain the viruses instead. All viruses do that. Some viruses then have a second sneaky trick up their sleeve. And this is particularly problematic for us as immunologists and for us actually as patients who get sick, because some viruses can go latent. They enter your body, they cause an acute disease typically that may be very short-lived and very mild, but they then don't go away, they hang around. And the most common example of this, I suspect many of you in the audience will know, who's ever had a cold sore? If you've had a cold sore, you are a living example of a latent virus. Okay, a cold sore virus enters your body, usually as a small child, causes an acute infection, you resolve the infection, and then it buries itself when it goes latent. And every so often, it will wake up and cause disease again. How do viruses do that? Well, they do it in a very clever way. They enter the body, they cause this infection, and then they leave behind a little copy of their genome. So if you're a DNA virus, and so cold sores are caused by herpes viruses, the same ones that cause genital herpes and all these other things, but different strains. And so these are DNA viruses. So they get into your cells, they cause an infection, and at the same time as copying themselves, what they can do is they can copy their DNA, and they can produce that DNA into a tiny little circular chromosome called an episome. And so in every nucleus of your body, you have all of these chromosomes that encode your DNA, your genome. But in the cells that have become infected, you have this additional tiny, tiny chromosome that is the virus's genome. And what has happened is the virus has evolved ways to hide that. And so your cell doesn't notice. It doesn't realize you've gained an extra chromosome. And now, as that cell divides and replicates, it copies faithfully also the virus genome. And then typically for something like herpes viruses, then every so often, particularly if you're a bit run down, or if there's an external stress trigger, and the most common trigger for things like cold sores is UV. So this time of year when the sun is out, we all go out and about and enjoy it. The damage that UV causes activates the virus and it starts to produce live copies and you get a cold sore. And so that latent virus wakes up. That's one sneaky trick. There's another group of viruses that have an even sneakier way of going latent, and these are the so-called retroviruses. These are viruses that have RNA, and you remember that's that working copy, not the original copy of DNA, but the working copy. They get into your cells, as I said, they produce the RNA in there, and the RNA is used to make protein, but they want to go latent. They need a way of making this functional copy of the recipe book into a permanent record. And so what they do is they back copy it into DNA, and now there's a little bit of DNA hanging around, and they cunningly cut and paste that into your own chromosome. So in the case of things like herpes virus, you have a bit of separate chromosome that is the virus living in your cells. But in the case of HIV, you have gained a set of genes integrated into your chromosome that you will inherit forever as those cells divide. And this is one of the reasons these retroviruses are incredibly difficult to get rid of permanently. You can stop the virus replicating, but you can't remove the copy because the copy is embedded deep inside your own genes in your cells.
This is so interesting because I'm going to tell you that we have something very similar in computing. We have latent viruses, and the most obvious example of that, the best known example of that, is Trojans, Trojan horses. But at the same time, I think there's an important difference here, right? Because what Trojans do is they start latent, and then they wait until they're remotely activated or triggered by an insider. And that insider can be someone who knows what they're doing, or it can be someone who's been tricked into, duped into activating the virus, the piece of software. Now, Trojans, why are they called Trojan horses? Well, we borrow a lot of language from biology, as you've seen with worms. It's a way of making something that is really abstract, computing, more concrete, more understandable. We also borrow a lot of language from fantasy and mythology. So the Trojan horse, if you remember your Greek myths, is a machine that the Greek soldiers hide in so that they can get in through the walls of Troy. And under cover of darkness, they stream out. This is Odysseus. He's the ringleader of all of this, cunning Odysseus. They stream out and they ambush everybody, and that is what brings about the fall of Troy. So these pieces of malicious software are designed to do exactly that. They masquerade as legitimate programs. They hide on systems, and they wait until they're activated, either remotely or by someone inside. Now, another prevalent threat at the moment is a thing called ransomware. You'll have heard a lot about this in the media. Ransomware does what it says on the tin. It's a piece of malicious software that locks all of your files and then demands a ransom in order to unlock them. And over the years, we've seen a change in how ransomware is delivered and its targets. So it used to be 10 or 15 years ago that it was mainly targeting all of us as individuals. And that's inconvenient. And of course, it's distressing because if it targets your home computer or your phone, you're losing things like your personal data, but also things like your family photos. But let's have a think for a moment about what happens when ransomware targets bigger networks of computers and for larger values of money. Think about, for instance, networks of computers for critical services. Well, in those cases, that can actually affect our physical safety. It can make us sick. So in 2017, there was a ransomware attack called WannaCry. It infected 300,000 computers worldwide in 150 different countries. And some of those computers, quite a few actually, were in National Health Service trusts. And it led to the cancelling of medical appointments, but also medical procedures and operations. And last year, 2024, there was a similar attack on a service called Synovis that provides blood testing for hospitals all around the country, and it led to similar levels of disruption. And when we're in that kind of situation, it can be tempting to pay the ransom because victims are thinking, God, this is really bad. People could get hurt. We need to pay up. But there are a couple of very good reasons why we recommend that you do not do that. One, spoiler alert, cybercriminals cannot be trusted. They do not always keep their word about giving you back your data and your access. So even if you pay the ransom, it doesn't guarantee that it's going to solve your problem. But also, when you pay the ransom, of course, that's going straight into funding more cybercrime. And that could be conducted by an organised crime group, or just as often, and particularly in the case of the WannaCry attack that affected the NHS in 2017, it could be a rogue nation state. Fun fact, it is estimated that North Korea derives between 8% and 50% of its GDP just from cybercrime. So, more and more, when computers get sick, we risk getting sick. We risk having it impact our physical health and our well-being. And it's not just about hospital networks, it can also be about all of those connected medical devices. I bet there are quite a few of us in here that have mental health and well-being apps on our phones. We have fitness trackers that communicate via Bluetooth with our phones. But also there are millions of us walking around now with implanted defibrillators and pacemakers, continuous glucose monitors, insulin pumps, and more brain implants. And if you're worried about this, don't be. But please listen to my lecture on brain-computer interfaces and the Internet of Things, all available online. But in all seriousness, of course, what that means is that you need to keep your phone secure. Because if your phone is using an app to report to your cardiologist or your specialist or your GP, then we really don't want to interrupt the proper functioning and the proper reporting of that.
So we're faced with this prospect of getting sick with viruses and maybe impairing our ability to fight off our viruses because of a virus in our computer software that's helping our antiviral approach. This is getting very complicated. So how do we tackle viruses biologically and how do we tackle them computationally? So biologically, unsurprisingly, we have lived with viruses probably for as long as there has been life on Earth. So if you look, there are viruses, for example, of bacteria, and as you'll hear in a minute, there are also even viruses of viruses. So it's a pretty good bet that we've had viruses for billions of years. And so consequently, most organisms, including ourselves, have evolved a whole range of ways to fight off viruses. And the question that we want to ask in the next few minutes is, can we learn anything from either the biological antivirus approach or the computational one that helps the other one deal with their threats? So biologically, how do we deal with viruses? And broadly speaking, there are kind of three approaches. The first one is, if it looks like a virus, it probably is do something about it. And this is a bit like, I think in the computational world, at least my IT department says things like, if you open an email that looks suspicious and has lots of typos and grammar errors, I mean, first question is, do you have a friend who has lots of typos and grammar errors? And if not, maybe that's a bit dodgy. So there's this kind of system that we use in our computer world that is kind of a kind of gut feeling, right? This looks a bit dodgy. I'm not sure I should click on this. You have got £50,000 refunded from HMRC. I mean, like, who's ever got a refund from HMRC? So there's a suspicion element. And our cells do the same thing. So here's a quite straightforward strategy. If a virus uses some kind of molecule that we don't use ourselves, you could just be on the lookout as a cell for that molecule, and if you see it, you could say there is a problem. And so here's a good example. This is rotavirus. This is a virus that causes a gastrointestinal disease, particularly prevalent in places with poor hygiene. So if you've traveled in parts of the world where maybe you don't have great sanitation, you might well have had a serious bout of diarrhea one day, and it was probably this guy to blame. It's a good example of virus and a good example of this kind of immunity, because rotavirus puts on its surface a rather elegant protein that you see here called a glycoprotein. It's a protein that has sugar groups stuck to the outside. And the really useful thing for us as humans is that this rotavirus glycoprotein looks nothing like any protein that humans make. And so it's quite easy, and indeed has been evolved, that if you can have a system that spots this protein, you can use it to say, there's a virus here, let's deal with it. And we indeed have a molecule that does that. This is TLR4, toll-like receptor 4. I love the fact that it's shaped like a question mark. I think that's a great bit of evolution there. And this protein binds lots of foreign molecules, including this one here. And it's a pretty straightforward system, because if this guy on your cells binds this guy, it knows there's a virus here, and it triggers a very, very potent immune response. So that's pretty straightforward. Viruses, of course, are not stupid. Their whole existence hinges on being able to trick your body into getting past it. So lots and lots of viruses have either evolved away from having these unique markers, or they mask them, they cover them in some other kind of concealing thing. So this system is good, but not perfect. So what we call higher vertebrates, like ourselves, have evolved an additional system on top that provides an additional level of scrutiny. And this is a very clever strategy in which your immune system is scanning cells of your body all of the time for the presence of a virus, even a virus that may itself be hidden. So here's an example. This is a particularly nasty virus, which happily we don't see anymore. This is smallpox. The little black dots here are smallpox virus growing inside a cell. Like all viruses, smallpox grows inside your cell and replicates itself. And that makes it difficult for your immune system to see it because it's hidden right inside a cell. However, all the cells of your body pretty much are permanently sampling their own contents and displaying little fragments of the stuff inside them on their surface in the context of, bound by, another protein, this green protein here called an MHC complex. And people who were at one of my earlier lectures will have heard me talk about this. This is like a kind of menu card. It's like, if you go out for dinner, maybe after this lecture even, you might wander past a row of restaurants and you have a look at their menu on the door, right? And you decide, do I want to go in or not? Because this is what they have on offer. All the cells of your body are doing this all the time. On their surface, they are displaying little bits of protein, the red bits, from within themselves to your immune system. And your immune system is looking at that, and as long as the red protein is human, it carries on. But the minute it sees a red protein that is not human, it assumes that cell is infected with something foreign, and then it kills it. And it does that in a really beautifully elegant way, and I've shown this video before, but I love it, from Gillian Griffiths' lab, so I'll show it again. So here is a white blood cell, the red one here, a T cell, scanning the surface of that blue infected cell and realizing that something is wrong, because that blue cell has on its surface a protein that shouldn't be there. And this T cell realizes there is something wrong with that blue cell, and when it realizes that, it wanders over, recognizes it, and delivers a killing blow, the red dye that goes in now. And now you'll see the infected cell curls up and dies rapidly afterwards. And so this system is very clever: spot a cell that's infected and then kill it. So our third and final attempt biologically to get rid of viruses, if those two systems don't work, you can't spot it straight away, you can't spot it inside a cell. The third approach, which is actually really the best one, is to anticipate your virus in advance. Be ready for an infection, for something that might come. Because viruses all have to get into your body and enter your cells. So there's a period of time after you've breathed in, for example, COVID-19 virus, in which that virus is vulnerable. It's still not yet got into your cells. You can spot it and deal with it. And of course, the way we do that is with these things, antibodies. And this is by far and away the most effective way of doing it. If you have an antibody that recognizes a virus, it will bind to the virus, and then depending on the antibody, it can do all sorts of different things. It might physically stop it entering a cell. It might clump the viruses together so they're got rid of by other bodily systems. It might flag them for destruction by other white blood cells. But this preemptive, protective type of immunity is the best sort. The only problem is it requires you to have antibodies in advance. And so you have to have either seen that virus and be once before and be ready for it, or have been vaccinated against it. And that, of course, is the limiting factor. But the preemptive strike is by far and away the best. And the question is, do we do something like that with computers too?
You know what I'm going to say? Yes, we do. So this is where antivirus really comes into its own. And what we're really looking for are things that shouldn't be there, foreign bodies, both users, so people, or user credentials trying to get into a system or a computer that shouldn't be there, and also programs. So that's why access control is so important. It's why you have a special login to get into your work environment, why you lose that when you leave a particular job. But of course, that means that those credentials have value. And that's why cybercriminals are always after your login credentials to your email account or your online banking. They have a value. And that's why you get all of those phishing emails asking you to put in your user details and your passwords. Now, when it comes to programs, well, I think the big difference here between biological viruses and computer viruses is the sheer scale of threats and the sheer number of viruses. So to give you an indication, there's one estimate that we are experiencing hundreds of millions of attempted cyber attacks every single day. And one estimate from Microsoft that every single day, 560,000 new viruses are detected, new pieces of malicious software. So clearly humans can't deal with that on their own, and so we automate some of that. You could say that to some degree, we rely on computers to look after themselves to some extent. What does antivirus do? Well, it tries to identify suspicious files or known malicious software. It seeks to quarantine that and then to remove it so it can't do any harm. So it might not stop the viruses actually coming onto a machine, but by scanning what's coming in, what's at rest on a machine, and what's going out, it can stop it having an effect. How does it do that? Well, it profiles known pieces of malicious software, so known malware variants, and it gives them a unique signature. And then it takes that database of signatures and it runs it through the machine that it's installed on. It compares all the files, and if it gets a hit, quarantine, remove. Also, it can create a virtual sandbox in which it can test suspicious files. It can analyze them in a way that it doesn't have a negative impact on the rest of the device or the system. And it even does things like heuristic analysis. So some types of antivirus software will look at common attributes and characteristics of files and say, well, it's not a known piece of malicious software, but it kind of behaves a bit like a piece of malicious software. But as I mentioned, with like 500,000 new types every day, prevention becomes really, really important. When antivirus works, caveat if you have it installed and it's up to date, even if you click on malicious software, say you download something in a phishing email, someone has told you that they love you and they'd like you to open a love letter. It could still happen, couldn't it? Even if you download that, your files don't get locked because it will recognize that suspicious software. But what we really want, of course, is to prevent this happening altogether. And that's where, for all the technical measures that we have in place to close those technical gaps and vulnerabilities, we actually need people to not click on scams as far as possible, right? So the technology won't save you. You still need to be alert as much as possible. The technology is the backstop if you mess it up. And let's face it, we do all mess it up. But that's the preferred, isn't it? You don't click on the malware. But even if you do, you've got antivirus that will hopefully stop you getting infected. Now, you mentioned HMRC. It's funny you should mention that. You're absolutely right. They never give you a refund. So that said, when you get an email like this, sometimes it's too good to be true, isn't it? And that's why we have junk email filters. Because it's to stop us having that in our main inbox. It makes it less likely for us to click on it. Now, we can see, top tip, this is probably not HMRC's official email address, but equally, importantly, you can see it was identified as junk, and that's where trusting your junk mail folder is a really good start. It doesn't catch everything, but it's a really good prevention measure. As I say, we all do it. If you click on malware because something is too good to be true, you're getting an HMRC refund, someone tells you they love you, etc. If you've got antivirus, it will stop your computer being infected in very, very many cases. Even if your computer does get infected, if you don't have, for instance, antivirus, or you're not updating your software that has antivirus built into it, as happens more and more these days, at least there may be some tools that can help you clean your machine. So there's a really good example that targets ransomware, and it's called No More Ransom, and it's a partnership between law enforcement, so the old police agencies that I used to work for, and some of the cybersecurity companies. And they have built software to decrypt some of the most popular variants of ransomware, which means that if you get your computer locked, you can get it unlocked without having to pay a ransom and without having to brick your machine. And most importantly, we can also help other people. So even if your computer is infected, if other people are protected, they are at least defended from what's coming out of your machine. So there are so many similarities between how biological viruses are communicated and how computer viruses are communicated, that over the last 10 years, a number of researchers, myself included, have started to advocate really treating cyber threats as a public health issue. And you can see how these parallels might work out. So we've talked about botnets and how they misuse processing power to spread viruses and attack other computers. But also, if you've got a social media account, you will know that people have their accounts hacked or cloned so that they can target your friendship networks. And then thinking also about influence operations, disinformation, misinformation, fake news. I mean, we even describe that, don't we, as spreading virally because it uses us to share the badness. We've got non-communicable diseases in the cyber world, so ransomware, but also denial of service, where you flood a website to stop it working, and then those phishing emails to scam you for money. But if we're really thinking about this from a public health perspective, we can also look to those risk behaviours. Sharing passwords is pretty risky. Not having antivirus or not having your software up to date. And being the kind of person who's a willy-nilly link clicker. That is a risky behaviour if you haven't checked that link out. But we can even say that there are environmental exposures of just being on the internet, just being out in the world in the same way that people may sneeze on you in public transport, using unsecured or shared Wi-Fi, shared devices, being exposed to fake news even if you don't take the bait, and you could even say just sharing your personal data over the internet is an environmental exposure of doing business in the modern connected world.
So I love the fact that in both of our respective worlds, we essentially boils down to people doing stupid stuff is a major cause of problems. And I particularly love the fact that a kind of love and romance is a big driver of problems, either clicking on
That's
love
true,
letters or I can assure you, having spent some part of my career in genitourinary medicine clinics on a Monday morning, I can tell you the stuff people get up to at the weekend is a big cause of communicable diseases. So there are so many parallels. What can we do about them, and can we learn from each other for the future of these kind of treatment strategies or prevention strategies? Biologically, actually, I think this is quite a good news story. I think we are in a really brave new world and exciting time for dealing with biological viruses in new and exciting ways. So, if we ever get there. So, there are ways to do this that I think are not yet in the clinic, but we might be able to. So one of the ways to do this is maybe you can turn your enemy's enemy into your friend in the same way that we do in other parts of life. And so one of the discoveries of recent years that has really transformed things is the discovery of viruses of viruses. So this big thing here on the screen is a giant virus. It's called virus. I love this story. It was found inside an amoeba, so one of these crawly single-celled things, living inside a water cooling tower in a really exotic part of the world, Sheffield. And so this was super exciting bit of biology was discovered in a water cooling tower in Sheffield. And then at the time, we didn't realize this giant virus, it was identified because it's so big, that was quite exciting. And we didn't spot the fact until later that this thing on the side is a little tiny virus. And it turns out that this tiny virus, now called Sputnik, is a virus of the big virus. It can only survive in a cell that is infected with the big virus, and then it hijacks the big virus's machinery to its own end. We haven't got anywhere near enough information or understanding of this process yet, but ultimately, I think we could start to think about whether there are viruses of viruses that you might want to use as a way to treat viruses. This guy doesn't infect humans at the moment, but what about if we could come up with a virus that tackles, for example, lung viruses that we get, typically acquired kind of cold viruses, or even some of the serious transmissible viruses that cause huge problems. This is that Sputnik, obviously. For those of you who don't know their space history, Sputnik, the little virus, is named because of Sputnik, the satellite around the first satellite in space. So that's one option. Second option, I think this is possibly closer to reality than my first example, but one that has, I think, huge potential, is this idea of tackling those latent viruses when they are latent. That has been a really thorny problem for medicine. Easy to tackle a virus when it's up and replicating because it's visible, much harder when it's embedded. However, the last 10 years have seen this massive revolution in genetics, and in particular, our ability to edit DNA and to change DNA with this tool called CRISPR. So CRISPR you might have come across. It derives originally from bacteria, and we have co-opted it as humans. We've engineered it to produce tiny, tiny specific edits into DNA. This is a process that's used now in labs all around the world for genetic engineering. It's used in things like agriculture, so precision breeding of crops, where you can make tiny single edits into DNA to, for example, make a frost-resistant strawberry or a potato that won't bruise, or these kind of things. But in principle, you could start to use this in people too. And in fact, the very first medicine using this was licensed by the UK just last year. So where the UK medicines regulator licensed this as a treatment for a disease, a genetic disease called sickle cell anemia, in which there's a mutation in patients that causes them extreme pain and health issues because their hemoglobin doesn't work properly. And so now you can use CRISPR to go into those patients and edit the DNA to correct that mutation and cure their disease. What about if you co-opt this process, though, not to cure a human gene, but to remove a viral gene? It is conceptually entirely possible, for example, to create a CRISPR that would target and mutate HIV. So maybe we can end up with a medicine where you could inject this, it would rummage through your body, find all those latent copies of HIV in your DNA, and damage them, essentially disabling the virus and rendering you permanently HIV-free. Or indeed, much more trivially, but probably in terms of numbers, a much bigger pool, what about doing the same thing for cold sores? What about if you could rub it on, destroy your herpes virus, and you never again wake up that morning feeling this kind of cold sore emerging on the end of your lip? So there's lots of ways I think we might be able to harness genetic engineering to tackle viruses. And I think one of the most attractive ideas, actually, is something that Vic just mentioned from a kind of computational world. We're really used to, in the computer world, right, having updates. Most of us, we turn on our computer, and actually, usually very annoyingly, right, you're running late for a meeting, and then it says, oh, there's an update, you really should do it now. And you think, oh,
You've
can
got
I
a
risk it?
Windows machine, haven't you?
Other machines are available. So there's this kind of idea of updating our antivirus software. We don't think about that for ourselves, but perhaps we should. What about the idea of a vaccine that you could just update, perhaps even remotely, when different viruses become available? Many of us get the seasonal flu vaccine, and that, of course, is a source of update. Every year, you go for a vaccine that's based on our best guess of the flu strain that will circulate that year. But now we have all sorts of technological tools that would allow us to do this in a much more kind of automated way. So, for instance, many of us are here today because our lives were saved during the COVID-19 pandemic by an mRNA vaccine, right? Like the Moderna vaccine, for example, that you see here. So these vaccines are created by synthesizing a piece of RNA that encodes the virus protein, and then you put that into our own bodies through the vaccine. Our own cells produce the protein that is the stimulus to make antibodies, and so we're vaccinating ourselves. The technology to produce RNA vaccines is actually relatively robotic and relatively easy to control, even not quite domestically, but it's getting there, in a kind of relatively small setting. So you could imagine a scenario in the future where we combine this kind of mRNA technology to synthesize RNA on a machine like this with a much more user-friendly way to give people vaccines. So, for example, there's quite a lot of work, and we talked about this in one of my earlier lectures, looking at the idea of patch-based vaccines. So instead of a doctor coming and stabbing you with a needle, which most of us don't like, you might be able to make a kind of plaster that has microneedles in it, and you stick it on your arm, and the microneedles deliver your vaccine. So what if we were to have a system in the future where perhaps your GP surgery had one of these machines, and every so often the health agency sent an upload saying, we've just identified a new virus, synthesize this, churn out all these plasters, and the next time you're passing your GP, you pick up a plaster, stick it on your arm, and you've been updated for the latest flu vaccine, COVID, whatever else is. And I think that begins to sound a lot like the way we tackle computer viruses, and is really quite an exciting kind of future potential. In particular, we might be able to combine that with some really big data flows. So, for instance, there is monitoring of things like chickens all around the world for avian influenza, which of course is a major human health threat. And there's monitoring of people. Increasingly, we swab people, we take DNA samples, we do all sorts of things. And so you could combine this data with automatic analytics, and you could almost in a semi-automatic way predict next year's virus, generate the vaccine, produce the plasters, perhaps even mail them out to all of us. And you open your letter on a Monday morning, it says, stick this plaster on, and tomorrow you can go to work safe in the knowledge you're not going to get some horrible next epidemic that otherwise would have swept the world. And I think that is a really exciting, maybe slightly science fiction-y, but don't hold your breath. Let's see if that is the future of human vaccines.
And certainly in computing, we're already seeing a huge impact of artificial intelligence, and particularly machine learning. So one of the things we've touched on this evening is that in cybersecurity, there is already far too much data, already too many signals. So what automation does, of course, is it makes sense of that in a way that humans simply can't. Really thinking about things like adding in some of those warning signals, those weak signals from threat intelligence, finding out what the bad guys are talking about before they actually do it, and building it into an automated way to proactively monitor, identify, and neutralize threats. But also having tools that learn. And as we're seeing in healthcare with things like cancer imaging and diagnostics, in computing as well, we're really thinking about discovery. So by pointing artificial intelligence, and particularly machine learning, at huge sets of data related to cyber incidents and malicious software, can we discover patterns that humans haven't until now? And then we have this really exciting prospect of self-healing software. Software that can identify those bugs, those vulnerabilities that can be exploited, and can fix them by changing itself before the bad guys have a chance to discover them. And then finally, we have some really groundbreaking research and innovation. That's just coming through now. And AI is really helping with that. We're looking at ways that we can reduce the risk of infection in the first place. So are there different ways that we can authenticate users and requests to systems and networks? This is no word of a lie. There are people out there who are working on tools to authenticate users continuously using brain patterns. And if you think that sounds like science fiction, well, we may all need to think again, because this, very much at the forefront of cybersecurity, is what I think is really heralding that blurring of human immunity and computer immunity.
And that's it. We hope you enjoyed that double act here, and we're looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.